meeting. I'm Kris Ashley. I'm a member of the board and I am in Portland. So tonight our meeting is pivoting, networking, and building your business in the times of COVID. Our presenter tonight is Roy Sue. Did I pronounce that right? Who's a financial advisor, speaker, angel investor, mentor to startups, and leads the Freelancers Union in Seattle. He's also a former UX creative director, having freelanced for over 15 years, so he has some skin in the game, and has been the hiring position at executive levels in New York City advertising. All right, Roy, over to you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And so, I'm honored to be here and just talk about kind of business issues. And the thing about kind of freelancing and what we do, it's it can be a very tough thing where we have to start dealing with the things that you didn't necessarily go into the business for. So let me see if I can share this. Okay. Yeah. Hold on a second. No, it's not.
Okay.
Whoops. Sorry, hold on one second. Okay, there, much better. All right, so pivoting, networking, building your business, and a little bit more about me. So I have spent 15 years as a freelancer. I graduated from art school and I went to New York to be a fashion photographer. Realized that early on in it that as much as I loved the art of fashion photography, I didn't necessarily like the business of fashion photography. So I ended up in the kind of the creative world in advertising. And I moved up in New York City advertising. I became the director of the digital department for one of the largest healthcare agencies in New York and the world. I led new business. And as I was doing that, one thing that always stuck with me was that when I first started, it was about the time of the dot-com bust. And so I kind of cut the tail end. And when the dot-com bust came, I realized personally that I was not prepared financially, I saw kind of warning signs that the company wasn't doing so well. And, I needed to kind of figure out what and when to move and what I should do. And that's when I started really kind of focusing on the business aspects as well as the creative assets. And so eventually I became a financial advisor now. I like to keep my art kind of private. Well, not necessarily private, but doing it on my own terms. So I'm still an active artist. I'm an actor. I'm also a screenwriter. So very well familiar with this space. Now, COVID. So this is obviously unprecedented. We don't really know what COVID will do from here and into the future. And this is the thing, is that the economy is starting to reopen, and I'm telling everyone the same thing, is that we simply don't know what the path forward is. Because I spent 10 years in healthcare advertising, and one of the things is the vaccine. It could be developed, it may never be developed. We have conditions that they've been trying to make a vaccine for years and still nothing happens. And the vaccine could come and it may not be very effective or safe. So that's if the vaccine comes. Now, the other thing is that we don't know, is it going to come back in the fall? Is it not going to come back in the fall? And so in this time, we just have to start assuming that what we're dealing with right now with social distancing and the way that companies have to adapt may simply be the new normal for possibly a couple of years. So given all of that, now you have to think about your own business and what kind of, who your clients are and what you should need to adjust, if anything, because so many businesses will be permanently changed. I mean, from the standpoint of some of the tech companies who have just made it a permanent policy that people can work from home now, and to there are some businesses that frankly will not recover during this time. So that's just a little bit about where we are right now, and the joblessness, like I'm sure most of you heard, like we're have some of the highest unemployments ever, but how long it will last, no one really knows. And because what you hear on the news is not necessarily the reality too. And I always like to tell people this is that the U.S. economy is run on, it's run on people spending and people feeling confident in the US economy. So much of what needs to be said needs to inspire confidence, not necessarily reality. Okay. Any questions specifically on the state of the economy?
Nothing's come in, so
okay.
Next.
All right. The next part, oops. Next parts I want to talk about is, as an individual, if you're an individual freelancer as an editor, this may be something that you don't necessarily think about, but assessing what your brand is and who your clients are. And so this is the first question I always want to ask someone is, why do people work with you? And the thing is with this question is we have to realize that in this state and age that when someone hires you, it's not necessarily just because of what you do and how good of the work that you do. So when someone actually hires you and wants to work with you, right? Think about it from the standpoint of someone in the hiring position. So when you're in a hiring position and you have to build a team, and even if this is a freelancer working from remotely, this person has to work on a team with someone else. And so the idea that you're being hired simply built based on your skill set is a false assumption. Because at the end of the day, hiring managers have to make sure that the person that they bring on can work with others. So I'd like to kind of like to say this. So if you think that you're being hired and you're trying to project yourself on one of these three things, that you're the best at what you do, that you're a really hard worker, or that you can actually compete on price, you basically marketed yourself as completely replaceable. And the reason is that you're not the best. Like no one ever is the best. And even if you were at some point in time, that's a very short stint. We all have only need to take a look at people who were at the top of the games. You look at notoriously some actors, for example, that are really hard to work with, that eventually the luster, the shine, it's removed and no one wants to work with them. And being a hard worker, well, this is just an assumption that everyone is a hard worker. And if you're competing on price alone, there is no loyalty here, because people who value price will simply go to the next cheapest thing when it comes along. And that is actually trying to do something based on price is often a losing proposition, because you haven't created the loyalty, and it's not a way to build sustainable business. And here's the important part. People do business with people they know and trust, because oftentimes there are business relationships that occur, and these business relationships, you may not be the best friends with the person that you're working with, but ultimately people do want to actually work with someone that they like, that they can have a beer with, they can have dinner with. And so when you think about it this way, there are times where I tell people that sometimes they are trying to separate the personal and the business life too much. You know, if you're the person that just comes in, does your work, and leaves, that also, you know, when times are lean and they don't know you and they don't care about you, then you're going to be the person that they look at for cutting. And it's regardless of your talent, because talent only goes so far. You have to have a minimum level because the work has to be of a certain quality. But beyond that, then it really becomes a lot about personal relationships. And so, so when you think about the personal relationships and what you actually project about yourself, right? In terms of a brand, if you're a product, there's what we say two things. There's a tangible and intangible. You know, the tangible is the actual product that you're selling. And in terms of an editor, it's like, you know, your proofreading, your, you know, all of the skills that you bring to the table. And obviously, this is the part that they need and they're hiring you for. But then there's the intangibles. In a brand, you know, this is the personality, the values, the reputation. This is why people actually continue to purchase the brand or work with the company. So the best way to think about it is think about Patagonia. Now, Patagonia is a company, and everyone knows it. It's outdoor adventure sports equipment. But it's a lot more than that, because they have a lot of initiatives that talk about how they're supporting the environment, you know, why they care about and do the things that they do. And for a lot of people, they shop at Patagonia because they know that when they spend money at Patagonia, because they like the outdoors, that they're actually supporting a company that will actually create sustainability in what they do. So both of them are side by side or needed. Now, when you're talking about an individual freelancer though, again, the intangibles is really the relationships you have with your clients. Why do they like you as a person? How easy you are to work with? You know, do you come into work, and if you're going in person, do people like you around? Because these are all just as important. Because as when I was in a hiring position and I had a staff of 15, I have had to, unfortunately, get rid of some people who I thought was brilliant, but they could not get along with other people. So when you think about it this way, then, how is someone kind of figuring out what your brand is? Now, if you work with a company and have been working with a company, they obviously have a history. But if you're trying to find a new client, oftentimes, you know, whether they're looking at you at LinkedIn or your resume, they got your interest, the chances are they're going to look a little deeper. And so I want to talk about social media. So the people that are hiring you possibly could be looking at your social media accounts. And so there was a stat in in financial advising that 25% of all clients decide not to work with a specific financial advisor because something they saw on their personal Facebook page. So the thing is that the idea that LinkedIn is your professional social media, Facebook is not, and what you do privately, they don't mix. Well, that's not really true, because it's so easy for someone to just go back and forth and take a look. So when you think about it this way, there's a lot of companies now that actually in the interviewing process will have you pull up your social media page. And if it is private, they will sit there while you unlock your social media page so they can review it. This is how serious it is, because all you have to do is take a look out in the world today and see how one employee doing something on social media starts reflecting on the company as a whole, which is, frankly, can be very unfair, but this is the steps that some companies are going through. And when you talk about your brand, and obviously it's a little different when you're talking about a company versus when you're talking about an individual, but I always like to point this out, even you know, because on LinkedIn, you have people who comment on different subject matters that may or may not be related to their core field of business. But this is part of the branding on showcasing the personalities. But this was a post on LinkedIn about Black Lives Matter that I thought was very poignant. So it was that, you know, all these people jumping on the bandwagon in terms of what they support, but ultimately the companies that come out and support it, are they really doing anything besides lip service? So there was also a very famous case back in I believe the early 90s when the airlines started advertising specifically to the LGBT community. And when they started doing that and doing their ads, they got called out by the community because they didn't have domestic partnership, they didn't have all these benefits that actually would benefit their LGBT employees. So, you know, this is the other thing just to keep in mind. It's a little less relevant for a lot of individual freelancers, but something to think about. So one of the biggest action items that you can do is basically review all your social media. So wherever social media that you use, and think about it as if you were the client and you went onto this and started looking at the social media, and would you hire yourself, right? So the other thing is that you know, there are times where in someone's social media, if it's all kind of political or if it's all, you know, just, it can reflect, even if the person actually agrees with whatever you're saying. The question, particularly on LinkedIn, the question is, will you be spending all your time at work talking about these things versus the work at hand? Because I'm sure many of you have worked with someone, because I have, that again, they just let a lot of what their personal, these things actually intrude on getting the work done. So that is something that is very relevant, and it's regardless of whatever your political affiliation is. So, and then lastly, you know, thinking about it this way too, is now that you try to figure out what you're trying to project and how you want people to view you, not only from your tangible and intangible, then flipping on the other way is, who do you want as clients? And what are you projecting? And then what are you, and how are you kind of approaching them, right? So for me, for example, you know, right now, you know, it's really important that I have clients that I like, that I get along with, and I don't want every type of person. There's, you know, one of the reasons why I work with a lot of freelancers and entrepreneurs is that I know that space really well. I understand the mindset that goes in. And, you know, I remember when I was 22 and I just graduated college, and I was literally would go down the street in New York to Chinatown and trying to figure out the $4.50 meal or the $5.50 meal because I could save 50 cents. And, you know, at the, I understand that that kind of building up your business and relationships and how money can be tight, the flows. So that's why, that's one reason why I do work with a lot of entrepreneurs, freelancers. But now for you on the flip end, as an editor, what type of clients do you want? So the first thing is, when you're trying to, one way to try to get new clients is you network, right? So when you're networking and you're actually trying to prospect, I'd like to say there's the good and the bad ways of doing it. So I know sometimes you go into these events and you just start talking to someone, and all they start asking you is, are you hiring someone? Do you know where they can get a job? Do you know that they can get work? And it just becomes so one-sided that you kind of just start pulling back. So the proper way to kind of network is, think about it again, that this is a relationship. You have to get to know the person. They have to like you. If they don't like you, it doesn't matter if you're really good at your job. There's going to be someone else that they like and is good at their job. So the first thing is, you know, listen, get to know the person, genuinely care about the person, like offer something. And I always like to say this is like one of the rules, that if you can offer someone something without them ask before you ask, that's kind of shows genuine concern, right? Now, the bad thing is that when someone you meet immediately starts with a sales pitch, starts asking if you have work, they talk all of the time. There's kind of a golden rule in what I do, is that when you're actually talking to someone, you should only be talking about a quarter of the time. So, and again, I mentioned this, separating your business and personal. So, now, any questions specifically on kind of that part in terms of branding, kind of networking, and kind of just identifying your clients?
Nothing in the chat box, but I do have a question for you, Roy.
Sure.
Do you find that having a social media presence versus not having one, like say you only have a LinkedIn page and your website, is that a benefit or a disservice?
Okay, so I'm going to say, I'm going to caveat this because this is the New York Northwest Editors Guild, and obviously all of you are editors, but you could have different lines of businesses elsewhere. And so it really kind of depends. It depends on how you want to position yourself. Since I lead the Freelancers Union, the last meeting, there was a man there who was talking about his website, and when I got into what his business did, I kind of told him that I don't even think he needs a website, because the amount of people who would hire him is fairly small because he's so specialized. They're not going to find him on a website. They're going to find him through a referral or direct contact, because there's just not many people who does what he does. So it depends.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Okay.
But nothing else? Anyone? All right.
Okay. Now, this is a fun subject, core business issues. Oh yeah, it's like, I know this is like watching paint dry, but a lot of these things can be really, really, really important. And one of the first things I want to talk about is kind of rates, assessing them, how much you should charge. And this is really, really important because, at 7 years when I was a full-time freelancer, knowing what the market rate is, knowing what you can get, because you don't want to shortchange yourself either, is really important. So, and I recently was just talking to a friend of mine, and she was asking for a rate, even though she was doing the same work, but it was two very different industries: advertising versus news/media, which always pays less. And I basically told her that she was going to price herself out of the market because she didn't take the industry into account. So the first thing is always to know, even if you're doing the same thing for two different types of companies, or if they're in a different industry, you have to do a research and figure out what is the differences in rates that you could potentially get, right? So the other thing is that there is sometimes when I was in hiring position, someone would come in and they would ask for a rate and that is so low. And then I realized why they were asking for the rate which was middlemen, or what I'd like to say, kind of like the headhunters, the recruiting agencies. And there's nothing wrong with them as an industry, but they do take a substantial part of the billing rate, anywhere from 1/3 to 50%. And there's a history, particularly in this area, why that is, which is the history of essentially Microsoft. So Microsoft was sued by contractors back in the 90s for stock options because they claimed that they were not contractors but employees. And it went all the way to Supreme Court, and Supreme Court ruled in their favors. So ever since then, this area specifically is very, very, very sensitive to that subject. And that's why in many companies, you have the 18-month rule. You can only work 18 months, then you have to take 6 months off. And there's all these variations to comply with that Supreme Court ruling. And so this is the easiest way to shortchange yourself, because if you do not have a recruiting agency, then you're doing the work of actually finding the company. So you're doing more work, so you should be compensated with more pay. Obviously, experience is important, but sometimes I meet people, and when I was a creative director, that when your rate cannot just be based solely on the number of years of experience, because it also has to be based on your skills and productivity. So there are times that someone would come in and they would ask for a rate because they're saying, I had 15 years experience, but they're doing the same work and the same speed as someone a couple years out of school. So there was no way that I could justify that. And that is not ageism. That's just a standard of the productivity and the skill set. And W-2 versus 1099, and this is an important thing, is that when you are W-2, and even if you're, you could be a contract employee, you could be on the payroll, versus when you are a 1099 and you have to manage all your own taxes. Oftentimes, there's additional expenses with being a 1099, which oftentimes people end up charging more for. So, for example, just the Social Security tax. Social Security tax, as a freelancer, you have to pay both the employer and the employee. That's 7%. So you have to take that into account somewhere. And lastly, flat rate versus an hourly. So there are different reasons why a client would want one or the other. I'll get to some of that a little later. But whatever your hourly rate is, if you have a job, the only reason to make it a flat rate, because you're taking the risk that it's going to take you longer than you think, is that you think that you can do it faster than other people. So when you charge a flat rate, it should not be the same amount that you do an hourly. Oftentimes, it should be because if they were to hire you for 10 hours, but you think you can get it done in 5 hours, you should still charge the budget for 10 hours. So that's something that's kind of like, depending on your field and what you do, you just kind of have to get a sense of what's right and what's customary between those two. And lastly, I'd like to point out that there is a serious risk of both overpricing and underpricing yourself out of the market. So everyone understands overpricing, but underpricing, sometimes people go in and they start lowering the rates to the point because they think that this is like, oh yeah, I'll get work this way and I'll build up a reputation. But it can backfire, because on the other hand, when someone sees your rate and it's so much lower than everyone else in the industry, the first thing that they think is, does this person know what they're doing? And it's a legitimate question, because if they did, why are they charging this rate? So oftentimes there are people that I've talked to that they got more work by raising the rates than lowering the rates. And so when you start talking about what your rate is, make sure you focus on kind of pitching your value, what you bring to the table, that's the intangibles. And as well as the tangibles, is there something that you do that's special, special skill sets? Are you going to come in here? Can you actually save them money at the end because of what you do, whether it's speed, whether it's efficiency, something. And because all of these things are important, because it's not all about hard work. And understanding your clients. Now, this is a factor that you wouldn't actually know unless you were in the hiring position. So, for example, when I was in hiring position for salary staff, sometimes for some companies, managers actually don't know the salary of their staff. That's how it is at some companies, and other companies they do. When I was in a hiring position, sometimes I would just get a budget for 3 positions, and I just had to figure out how to split it out, right? And but as a freelancer, this is something that you need to think about, is the hourly versus flat, and how that affects their accounting, right? So if you're hourly and you're under the payroll, for example, oftentimes those companies then whatever you charge, they charge a premium to the client. The more hours that you work, the more they charge the client. This is a traditional kind of service fee model. And so if you think that you can do it twice as fast as someone and you charge twice as much, guess what? At some point in time, then the client isn't actually able to charge that premium because they have to charge what the industry sees as a norm. And I've had a freelancer actually argue with me that's saying, well, you're going to save more money at the end because I can actually do it twice as fast. And he wasn't understanding that every time he was making that argument, he was making an argument why the company would make less and less money off of him. So that's where flat rates can come important, because a flat rate from an accounting standpoint might actually just simply be a line item as an expense, which is not an employment expense. And won't get into that, but again, understanding how your clients bills, why they want to do it, and is really key. And ultimately, when you're trying to find out information like this, like make the conversation about them and not you. And sometimes people go into this and just talk about why they need something. You need to make sure you explore what they need and how you can accommodate them, because that is how they show and see and appreciate that you're trying to make their lives easier. When should you reevaluate your rates? So one thing is inflation. So, I mean, your billing rate should increase, if not every year, at least every 2 years or something, just to account for the fact that everything costs more. If you're not actually increasing your rates over time, you're actually making less and less money because of inflation. Now, the second thing is if you acquire new skill sets, certifications, something, obviously you should also increase your rates. This kind of somewhat falls in line with inflation, because the more work that you do, the more experience that you have, and you should be charging. Now, this is an important part with where we're talking about now, market conditions. In some industries, work is slim, in some industries, work is not. And some industries, notoriously, when work is slim, everyone lowers the rates. And that's something that you just have to be aware of, because if everyone lowers your rates and you don't, like you shouldn't compete on price alone. It is a consideration factor. And lastly, do you provide a better service or product somehow than average, right? So this has nothing to do with number of years experience, because in the creative world, right, when I was looking at art directors, for example, some people's books are just simply better. So yeah, they probably get premium from that. And lastly, I'd like to say, know when it's time to move on, because sometimes you could just outgrow a client, and maybe this happens with people who actually just start their careers, and if they start something full time, they can't advance because they see them as the person at this level, and that just sometimes happens, and it's unfair. But if it does, you just have to know maybe it is just time to move on. Okay, payments and estimates. So this is like if you're, this is really important to denote, is this work for hire? And are they taking all the responsibility of liabilities? And if they're putting you on a W-2, even if you're hourly and contracting, that's essentially what they're doing when you're an employee, then you don't really need a lot of these contracts and a lot of do something substantial, because you're essentially an employee of the company, and the company takes full ownership. And if you're putting you on payroll, you're probably getting paid every week or every 2 weeks. And so that's if they use a payroll service. Now, the other thing is they could be using a payroll services, but not actually be a W-2. So they could be just cutting you a check, and figuring out if they're something like an editor, maybe they will be paying you every week or every 2 weeks. Or is it something more, if you're charging a flat rate or by a project? That's where you have to start thinking about what your contract and your estimates should include. And so in that case, what someone can actually absolutely kind of screw themselves over is if they don't stipulate what the terms are, such as the number of changes, the number of reviews, and if you go beyond this, change order will be given. So change orders are absolutely fine because they happen all the time because maybe it's not your client, but their client, in particularly advertising, for example, the advertising client just came back with more and more changes. Well, if that happens and you're not on an hourly, then yeah, you should absolutely renegotiate based on the new requirements. And so when I was freelancing, for the most part, I was on, I did a lot in which I was on payroll or on an hourly basis, but there were times I took flat projects. And in those times, then this was the formula that I used, not necessarily what you should use, but basically it was a third upfront just to hold the position, a third at a specific deliverable milestone, and for me it was the approval of the the designs, and the third at the delivery of all of the files. So I think personally, I think it's important that you charge upfront before you start any work, at least somewhat. And while as an editor, you probably have very little out-of-pocket expenses, but I was also a photographer, and in those cases, sometimes anything out of pocket, I always got prepayments before I started the work. And lastly, like liability protection. Again, if you're in the creatives, this is the last thing that people mind, but this is really, really, really important. As an editor, the work could be very much work for hire or seen more as kind of a technical skill set versus a creative where you have kind of ownership. But in the realms of that with the liability, you need to protect yourself in a couple of ways. So if you are a freelancer, first thing is incorporation. For most people, something as simple as an LLC, which is very easy to do, you don't need a lawyer, is fine. And when you aren't incorporated, either as an LLC, C Corp, and S Corp, you're essentially a sole proprietor. And a sole proprietor means that you and your business are one, and if they're suing you based on your business, they're suing you as a person. As an LLC, they're suing your company and not yourself. And so that provides kind of the barrier, just in case if that happens, that they can't go after your house, for example, right? But this is really important. This only applies if you have separated your business and your personal banking, because if they are intermingled, the whole idea of having an incorporation just went out the window because you just what they call destroyed the veil of protection. So this is where good bookkeeping is necessary. Otherwise, the incorporation does not protect you. And as an editor, you're in a very, very low liability business. Generally speaking, someone's going to give you something that's theirs, and you're just providing technical skill sets. But business insurance for something like this is fairly cheap. And if you are in also as a writer, this is where you do need some liability protection, because just in case you did something that someone ends up trying to sue you for. And so business insurance is something that everyone should have. Now, the last thing is, if you are doing something with a flat rate project and you're not a W-2, it's not work for hire, then it's really important that you have the standards for whatever industry you're in terms of the legal contract terms. Things like errors and omissions, which if the client forgets to put something in that makes them liable, you're indemnified. Someone can't go after you simply because you wrote something on the behalf of a client because the client forgot to tell you something. So, and ownership, again, the work for hire, or do you do this? Do you have any rights afterwards? Or do you own full ownership, partial ownership, no ownership? These are all things that you need to stipulate, because otherwise it very well could be that someone could argue that the writing that you did, is theirs. and where you thought you were writing for them, and then they could use it for a short amount of time, and then it would go back to you, which is kind of very common in like the photography world. Copyright and yeah, so you need indemnification. If someone's giving you something that they have stated that they have the copyright authority to work on this, and they give it to you, and so because you worked on it, you're not liable in case there was a copyright infringement. So there was I had a friend who was a photographer, and they found one of the photography on this doctor website, and basically, the doctor website actually ended up getting a bill from their stock agency, and the doctor's like, "Well, I didn't do anything. It was the designer." Well, guess what? He is liable because in that contract, it didn't say that the designer was actually secured in the copyright. So if he had that, then that would have been all the way back to the designer, because the designer basically stole the photography. So in this case, you don't want to be given like a screenplay to write that ended up being owned by someone else, and that third person suing you directly. And the credits. Do you, depending on what you do, particularly in the creative writing field, like magazine articles or something like that, there's oftentimes a standard credit, and the credit actually does mean something because it goes to your experience. So make sure that you know what it is that you want in your contract. Any questions on that part?
Nothing has come in. Come on, folks, please ask questions. There's got to be something you're curious about or want more information on. Anyone? If you don't want to type it, Aaron. Yeah, hold on, let me unmute you.
Can everyone see me? I see the this little logo when I turn the screen sharing off, so just want to make sure.
Yes, we can see you, or okay. I can.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kris, for unmuting me. I'm not able to, first, just a technical thing. I'm not able to type anything into the group chat, and I don't know if anyone else is having that problem. But that's why I raised my hand.
Thank you. Oh. Let me check on that.
I am having the same problem.
Oh, great.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that might be why you're not getting questions.
Yeah, I just see that chat is disabled on my side too. So, all right. Why don't we just stop here?
This is new. This is Zoom's new version. Everything is disabled until it isn't.
So
let me see if I can figure this out.
While you look at that, I do have one quick question. I'm just curious. Roy, if you have any recommended, I know there are a lot of contract templates available on the internet. I know the Freelancers Union has one. If there's any that come to mind that you think are exemplary.
I don't even want to comment on that because it really depends on the industry you're in. Even if you're an editor, like it's very different terms for someone in like medical editing versus like children's storybooks. So I don't really want to comment on that. So, but I think that, it's, there's a lot of good places to start. And, I'm not suggesting that you go out and necessarily have to hire a lawyer, but at least ask around to people who do the type of editing that you do.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Of course.
Okay. Since I can't write it down. I'm curious, in your experience, when there are downturns in the economy, does that affect the rates that are out there that people can comfortably ask? It seems like there's a contingent of our society that's fine and they're working and up and running, and then there's whole sectors that are not fine. And so how do we how can we sort of have our finger on the pulse of that right now?
I'm going to actually talk about part of that in the next section about pivoting, and it's really trying to figure out how your clients are being affected. So I'll answer that, but to answer the broader question is, it depends. Generally speaking, in a downturn, rates do tend to go down because they have to. There's more people, and the question is there, for your type of editing, how many people do it, and are there a lot of people that are out of work? Because if there are, then supply and demand. There's more supply than demand, so things have to go down. I remember starting my career like right before the dot-com crash, and then there was 2008, and those rates definitely went down. I knew people back in the day that this is, God, I'm aging myself, but this was like over 20 years ago. Before the dot-com bust, people could charge in New York, $70, $80 an hour for art director, and then suddenly it dropped to $35 after 2001. That was extremely dramatic, and of course, they worked in the dot-coms, so it depends.
Thank you.
Okay, since chat isn't working, if you have questions, either raise your hand or put up a checkbox and I'll call on you. I'm sorry, folks, I can't figure out how to get the chat unlocked. I'm not seeing a lot of the controls I used to, and I think Zoom has broken things again.
Did anyone have any questions about the branding section then? Kind of like the networking, relationship building?
Beth, you've been wanting to ask something, yeah?
Oh, yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, we can.
Okay. When you were talking about why do people work with you? I didn't actually have a question. I had a comment that I had just on the weekend gotten a wonderful testimonial where someone told me they appreciated the great care I had taken with their manuscript. Yeah. And so I have some nice relationships with clients, and this was a new one. But I guess I do have a question. I wonder, how would I turn that to showing that I do that? I have plenty of individuals, a handful of individuals who will readily say, you really helped me, and I really appreciate your work.
So
where would you broadcast that, or how would you share that with other people?
So here's a couple things with that, and it's really important. It's that are you trying to get when you're saying sharing, are you trying to get new clients and people you don't know, or are you trying to kind of share with people that you do know, or in some ways, because when the economy slows down, and again, just think about it this way: like if you were in a hiring position and there's 10 people looking for work, and you can only hire like 5 of them, you're going to probably go start thinking first, are any of them my friends, close friends? You're going to hire them first, right? And then after that, then if you don't know any of them at all, then it's always kind of a crapshoot, because some people interview really well, and then when they get to the job, then they become a diva, then all these things come out. And if someone is referred by someone I trust, I immediately look at them first. So if you are getting these great praises about like being really easy to work with, the best thing is actually go to that person. If they don't have work for you, ask them, can they refer you to someone else? You can go on the LinkedIn. Are they LinkedIn with someone? And chances are, when they refer you, they're going to say how great you are.
You're right, because I have gotten work from referrals, but I don't always know how that happens. It can happen over a couple of years, time pass, and then, they referred me. Yeah, you're right. I should.
Yeah, in this day and age, I think the best way of new business is referrals, if you can. Obviously, you're going to have to always reach out to new people, but the barrier on a new person is much, much more significant, because, I remember this one time, this one year, it was use it or lose it season in advertising, the fourth quarter, and I had to hire 10 freelancers in 1 week. And so basically at that point in time, my criteria was, do they have a resume, a portfolio online, and can they show up on time? I had several people who could not do those three things. So you just never know what you get. Like there was this one woman that came in, and she I only took her because of her referral, and she did not work out. She didn't show up on time. She was kind of like, I think, on drugs. And when I told the recruiter what happened, I mean, obviously they were trying to make it right, trying to refund something, and they knew that their reputation was on the line because they pushed for her to come in. So that's where the people who refer, like, think about it this way: if someone came to you and asked you for a referral to someone for work, you're not going to refer that person unless you really like the person and can vouch for them.
Yeah, makes sense.
Like I'm personally like, in terms of like putting testimonials like online for something like an editor, something like that, I'm a little hesitant to do that. It's one thing when someone's like talking about what a great product something is, but when you're talking about a person, it just,
Sorry, Roy. You seem to be muted. Hang on a second. I will unmute.
yeah. So as I was saying, like personally, like those type of testimonials for someone like an individual, like an editor, like I just find them to be a little too self-gratifying, and like I almost think less of the person because I think that this person's compensating for something, but that's kind of me personally.
Roy, sure. Can I jump in for just a second? Amy, one thing that I always do, because most of my clients are through referrals, when someone approaches me, I ask them how they found me. Yeah. That's the first thing I ask. And usually it's because they're a friend of someone I worked with, and in that case, my automatic thing is, oh, great, and then I just send the other person a thank you note. But it's really helpful to find out who's sending you people, or if they found you online and how. That's just a standard question, and it's a perfectly reasonable one.
I mean, like no one should have any problem answering how they found you and why they reached out. So, I mean, they're reaching out. So.
And one other quick thing, chat is finally working. Sorry, folks. Apparently, the new security settings is chat is off until the host turns it on. All sorts of things I'm learning. So if you'd like, please go ahead and put your questions into the chat box. Otherwise, I can pause, and if you'd rather do it, just put your hand up, and I will call on you after the next pause. Okay. Thanks, all.
Any more questions? Okay. All right, so me, so. Okay, so here's the next part I want to talk about, which is pivoting. So with everything that's going on in the world, do you need to adjust your business somehow? Now, when I talked about this with other groups, obviously it was more of a mixed crowd where some of the businesses could not be done remotely, and some of it could. And generally speaking, as an editor and a writer, yes, you can work remotely. So some things are easier. But when you're thinking about your own business and even in editing, it's like, who makes up your client base is going to basically influence what's the state of your business, right? So, the first question is, are you a must-have or a nice-to-have? And with companies cutting back, anything that's a nice-to-have is just going right out the door. They have to focus on the things that will be the core business. So, generally speaking, editor, I would imagine it's always kind of a must-have. Everyone needs to make sure that their work is polished, but if you have other businesses, it may or may not be that way. But the parts of being a must-have is like it should be essential to their business, or you do something that will save them more money than they spend, and other ways that you support them. Now, the other thing is your customer base. So do they work in industries that's going to be more affected? For example, if I don't know, editing for kind of the travel industry, or hotels, or like the restaurant business or something like that, where clearly the amount of work that's going to come out is going to be less, then you're going to be more affected. And at that point in time, as a customer base, do you need to expand your customer base to industries that are less affected? That's another way to take a look at it. And this is very true in advertising, where advertising agencies have clients. So as a whole, advertising may have been hit, but some agencies could be hit much, much, much worse because their clients are in the industries that have been more affected. So in that case, then you have to take a look at that and say, I'm at risk here because my main clients may hire less, and again, then you need to expand. And the last one, well, this could affect you actually, but it's, the thing with COVID and how it affected the economy is basically, it's very uneven. Around Seattle, some people I have clients that literally completely unaffected by this, and other clients that their business is completely shut down. And, there is the thing, unfortunately, where, if you have clients that have more traditionally struggled with their income or the budget, they're probably going to be more affected than others. Like, think about it this way, like a nanny who clients are like, corporate executives, probably not going to be affected by this at all. But daycare worker is going to be more affected because those families are not going to be able to pay for childcare. So, and then lastly, this may affect you guys less, but assessing your personal situation of, this may be more of the situation if you're just starting to build your business, that is it better just to take the time off right now, do something else, and come back to it. This is definitely true of any business in which there's higher startup costs that you have not incurred yet. Or even if you did, can you just, if there's ongoing costs that you can cut by just taking some time off and coming back to it. The second thing is always, and I always say this, like, do you even like what you're doing anymore? So, I had a part-time photography business for like 15 years. I was also the president of the Stock Artists Alliance at one point in time. And I used to love photography, and you can kind of see the back of my apartment right now. And part of it, I got this loft because I could turn it into a photo studio. And the reality is that I just realized that I was going through the motions and I didn't even like doing it anymore. So that was the point. I was like, I was just doing it for money, and then the money just got tougher. And so I just stopped altogether. So that's another thing just to kind of think about. And, as an editor, this probably means less to you. Well, maybe or maybe not, again, because if you're in a position to get a full-time job somewhere and versus freelancing, given where we are in the economy, it just might be a better thing in some ways for some people, because maybe you have a mortgage that you have to worry about. And this is just figuring out, like, at this point in time, is freelancing more of a risk, less of a risk, depending on how busy you are and where you see your industry going. But these are also things that you should think about. So what happens if you have pivoting and you realize that your business, even if it's going well, it's at risk because of some of the things of like their client base or all these other factors. So, the first thing is, can you change your service somehow? Like if you were a nice to have, can you change it to a must have? Like particularly if you're on the creative writing side, do you just go into industries that have to keep publishing, right, versus the ones that can come back? Can change your delivery? Well, this is obviously less affecting editors. You know, the issue of your cost and price point. Yeah, this is definitely something that should be looked at. Now, in the last Freelancers Union, someone came up, questioned, well, she wants to look at jobs in other cities, right? And I warned her about one thing though is, well, two things. Number one, the whole idea of referrals and networking, and it's hard enough when, as a hiring manager, hiring someone who you don't know, even if they're in the same city, but when they're in a different city and you can't ever meet them, it's even a higher risk. So it's harder there. And second of all, Seattle's an expensive city. So if you are trying to get a job in for a client in Minneapolis, for example, or some other city that's a lot cheaper, chances are the rates are going to be lower there. So you could potentially just completely price yourself out on the market. But at the same time, if you charge what they charge in some of these smaller cities that are so much cheaper, you perhaps can't pay your bills. So this is where you just have to take a look at that situation. You know, when I first moved to Seattle, I was freelancing for almost 4 years for New York agencies. And for the most part, their rates were higher than Seattle. So it wasn't a big deal. But that may or may not be the case, particularly if you were in New York. And lastly, can you add any type of services or something probably less relevant to editors, but never know, like something that you can change the delivery or the process. Like if, say, like you teach a class on editing, right? And you used to do one-on-one tutoring. Maybe you do a group session where everyone can pay less but it's more affordable. All of these things are things that you just need to start thinking about, because this is a way for, the last is a way potentially that you're not actually cutting your rate, you're just changing how it's billing because you're allowing more people to be there. So the action items that everyone should do is first, like, you know, definitely you have to know what your clients' your client's situations are. Are they going to be affected? Because we're still in the first couple of months where there's a lot of the government programs that are still in place, but they're going to end in the next couple of months. And now is the time to think about, when those things end, are you going to be in more or less, you know, danger, and if you are going to be potentially at more risk in the future, now's the time to start thinking about how you get different types of clients or advance more leads that way. And then you should also assess your personal situation. Like, you know, is this the right thing for you right now? Is this something that you can step away from, depending on how long you've been doing this and how much clients you are? Like, if you're just in the client building process, these times are so much more difficult. And most important, think about the long-term plan, because really, we don't really know how long this will last with COVID, because if the economy shuts down again through a quarantine, who knows what could happen? And I'm not saying it will or won't, it's just no one knows. Okay. So that's my information, and if anyone wants to connect with me, and but otherwise, anyone have any questions?
We do have one, Roy, and this actually is a generally good question. How do we argue as editors or as any other freelancer, how do we argue that we are essential services? I mean, this was asked specifically for editors as layoffs of copy editors continue, but how do we argue with clients or employers that we are an essential need? Do you have any tips?
All right, so I have to think about this as an editor, because it's a really tough part, because I have to think about this one. Because I'll give you another situation that's happened where I know a reporter for CNN, and used to be you were a reporter, you hired a photographer. Now, for what he does when he travels, he has, because he's not like he doesn't actually have a reporter next to him, like he's not doing the real high profile stuff. He videotapes, uploads, writes, and does everything. And now he's become essential because he basically, he's a one-man shop. And in terms of a copywriter, and I'm seeing the comment now about like the layoffs where, they're just saying, okay, the writer has to do their own editing. Fortunately, I can see that happen more and more. And so the thing about that is, for like, one way is how do you combine multiple things so that you can provide more services or have that value add beyond copy editing. Otherwise, the other thing is that if they lose you, right, this is where it's, penny wise, pound foolish. Like, are they just coming out with work that is inferior because all these errors are coming through? And particularly depending on what you do, what type of editing you do, that could have legal liability for the company. If you're in like medical editing, education editing, for example. So, that's another way to do it. But unfortunately, I could see the people saying more copy editors that the writers just have to do it.
Okay, thanks, Roy. Anyone else have any questions? Go ahead and either type it into the chat box or raise your hand. And Roy, can you share your slides with me and I can
absolutely.
put them up? Lovely. If folks would like a copy of the slides, you can email me. I believe my email address is on the invitation, but I'll put it in the chat box.
Yeah, and then I'll also send the link to the Freelancers Union. Like if our focus is a lot on kind of the business parts of it, the networking parts, and so there's obviously a lot of overlap in terms of for freelance editors. Where we also are hosting everything free of charge on through Zoom right now. So, and I'll share that information afterwards. So.
All right. If there's no, okay. Erin, just going back to rates, this is a comment from Erin. Most of her clients, publishers, set the project rate, and she raises her rates by doing the job more quickly over time.
That's okay. That's so there's nothing wrong with that if you're and that's what happens with experience, right? So let's just say the rate is $500. Someone who's right out of school may be struggling, like just take longer because they just know, and you can do it in an hour. And if that's the case, and you can get more and more clients, then you are essentially paying yourself more over time, and so there's nothing wrong with that, and that'd be great.
Thanks.
So,
anyone else?
Yeah. One thing I'll say about project rates, because there was so I used to be on the board of ASMP New York, which is the American Society of Media Photographers, and ASMP back in, I believe, the late 70s, published a survey about the photography rates. And it was just meant to be a survey to inform other photographers about what the, just to let people, educational service, this is what people are charging. Then when they published that, that became the set rate for the entire industry. That's always something to be careful about too. And, and that's also sometimes how these universal rates in the industry occur. And when that happens, unfortunately, there's just as an individual, there's very little that you can do to change that, because they really hammered the magazine industry, magazine photographers specifically.
All right. Thanks very much, Roy. This has been a great presentation. One last check. Anyone have any further questions before we sign off?
Yeah.
Anyone?
And if you know, glad to help, and you know, definitely reach out to me if anyone wants to talk about other things, particularly you know, things dealing with my primary business as a financial advisor. I'm happy to also answer any questions offline.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And as I said, the recording for this will be up probably sometime later in the week.